Hello and welcome to The Machine. On this podcast, we talk about technology and computer science with a particular slant on education. That's because we're based in Waterford Institute of Technology in the southeast of Ireland. My name is Rob O'Connor and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Computing and Mathematics here. In the last couple of episodes, we focused on some sub-disciplines of computing, specifically Internet of Things and cloud computing. We have more of those coming in the next few weeks. This episode is a little bit different though. It's a one-on-one conversation with a former faculty member from the department, an individual who's had a very long and interesting career in technology. I'm speaking about Mícheál Ó'Foghlú, who's currently engineering director at the core developer unit of Google, based in Munich, Germany. Before that, he was the chief technology officer with Red Hat Mobile, which grew out of FeedHenry, where he was also CTO. Prior to that, he was one of the founder members of the TSSG research group in WIT, now renamed the Walton Institute, and indeed before that he was a lecturer in the Department of Computing and Mathematics at WIT. Now Mícheál, he's a great man to chat, and he has many wide and varied interests, from computer programming through to travel, hiking, history, reading science fiction novels, music, language, and even a bit of philosophy. We recorded a conversation in which we looked back at Mícheál's career to date, and he offered some sage advice for any students starting out on their journey into computer science. Although, to be honest, his advice is relevant for anyone, whether you're a beginner or 20 years into your journey. Anyway, I began our chat by asking him if he could identify the one thing that excites him most about technology.
So for me, the most exciting thing about technology is the culture of innovation that, especially when coupled with the Silicon Valley sort of entrepreneurial culture, refuses to lie down and looks at the most difficult problems that we have and says, we can figure out a way of using technology to solve these problems and to make life better for people. And so there's a constant cycle of new and exciting ideas, new ways to combine technology, bigger and bigger challenges to try and face. But the atmosphere is one of enthusiasm and collegiality and support. And it's sort of the culture of the positive attitude that we can make a difference. That's probably the key thing that motivates me to stay in the industry.
Mm. So I'd like to ask you about maybe what your earliest memory is regarding computing. And the reason I mention that is recently Clive Sinclair passed away, who invented one of the earliest home computers, or certainly the ones that I would have seen anyway. And I remember back in the day mucking about with an old Atari and then later on an Amiga computer. But was there any one thing that caused you to get bitten by the bug?
Yeah, so very much linked up with the Sinclair story. Probably the first computer I had access to was a dedicated word processor unit that my mother brought home from her sort of administrative work in the civil service in Northern Ireland. And I was very interested in it and playing about with it. It was kind of like it was hard to get down to the underlying operating system or whatever. But then I got a ZX80, a ZX81 and a Spectrum. And I did programming on them, and I learned to my cost the limitations of just how much capacity they had. I coded a library system, but I was only able to store about 5 books in it. And then I went on to university and studied computer science and English as an undergraduate degree, and I got access to slightly beefier machines when I went to university in England. Yes.
Okay, yeah. And where did you study, Mícheál, your undergraduate degree?
I went to a fantastic institution that's called the Kiel University. And what was so brilliant about it was that it had a multidisciplinary approach to its education program. So it encouraged people to combine completely different subjects that wouldn't normally be part of a common program. So there were lots of people studying computer science and music. There were lots of people doing psychology and computer science and things like that. And I ended up studying English and computer science. And I actually went there with that in mind. And they had a first year of the program where you actually didn't do your chosen subjects. You basically did random subjects that you could choose from each of the three primary discipline areas, the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. And then you could change your mind about what you wanted to study. And that tried to sort of redress one of the key problems that the British secondary school system has, which is that it specializes people very early. Like typically you only do 3 or 4 A-levels. And so most people are doing all science A-levels. So from the age of 16 onwards, they've just stopped doing any social science or any humanities. And I always thought that was very narrow. So I was very attracted to the Keele model.
Yeah, often I wonder the way we do things in WIT and across generally the Irish third level education sector, it is very specialised. You focus on a particular area, whereas people I know who've been to America, they have that more kind of liberal arts model where you might study one thing, but you have a minor in something else that could be completely irrelevant to the main discipline, but it allows for probably a more broad education and a greater development of the person as a whole. You know, I'm interested to know, what was it about English that attracted you?
So I was very interested in history, and my father was a Latin and English teacher.
Okay.
And I did study Latin in secondary school. And so I was attracted to the English program in Keele because they actually had the ability to study Old and Middle English, and they had language lab classes where you actually learned how to speak them. And so you kind of immersed yourself in the mindset of what it might be like to, say, try and write a poem like Beowulf in Old English.
That's absolutely fascinating. And there's a common theme here that everyone I know in computing has some other major interest. Everyone has, whether it's music or English or sport or it could be anything that they're active in. And there's an interesting thread through that it is a multidisciplinary discipline.
Yes.
What do you think about that as a kind of as a strangeness in a discipline?
Yes, I think it is weird. In the history of academic disciplines, computer science is relatively new. You know, it's a number of decades old, and probably the oldest academic discipline might be mathematics. But it's interesting how new computer science is, and how at its core it's a very applied discipline. So it can be used by nearly any other discipline to make progress in their discipline. And there is some theoretical work that can be done, but like in terms of how many people working in computing, it's like 1% of people working in pure theory, and the rest of us all work in different aspects of applied computer science.
Which goes back to what you were saying at the very, very start, though. It's about there's maybe some problem or some area that you think you can have a positive impact, and then you can perhaps achieve that through computing.
Yeah, but I've actually got a doctorate in education. And I'm interested in how education evolves, and I'm interested in how computer science is perceived. And one of the most influential educational theories of the past 3 decades, that came out sort of in the 1990s, is this concept of mode 1 and mode 2 science. So the idea is that mode 1 science is the traditional disciplinary way of working within a subject, becoming more and more expert, doing a PhD where you sort of are a miner going to the face of and mining a very narrow seam of knowledge associated with a specific speciality that you're associated with. And how is this done? You publish academic papers, they're peer reviewed, they're published in journals. The most impactful journals are the ones that have been around for like hundreds of years. And so the amount of time it takes for the academic departments exist in universities that map to these disciplines and so on. So these sort of things take hundreds of years to actually build up and develop. And many of our structures originated in the 19th century as a side effect of the Industrial Revolution. And that's where our current sort of traditional university disciplines come from in the main. But now what's happening in the late 20th and early 21st century is what the Mode 2 science authors, which includes a guy called Gibbons, so it's Gibbons et al. 1994, about this new modes of knowledge production. And there's this concept of transdisciplinarity. And so the idea is that for a particular project, you get together a group of people with different disciplines, they work together and they solve some problem together using their different expertise. Then you write an academic paper and you go, which journal do we publish it in? And it's often very difficult because if you publish it in one of the expertises, they'll say, no, it's not. There's a little bit of it, but it's not relevant enough to us. Right? And interestingly, the discipline itself may not even continue past that project. So it's almost like ephemeral. It's continuously changing. And so in this, the recognition that the authors have is to some extent the staticness of the structure of universities means that they cede this new innovative area to other organizations that are more flexible and able to deal with this flexibility, typically big companies who have the ability to create project teams with people from many different disciplines. And I'd regard where I'm currently working in Google as a typical example of that sort of 21st century model of a kind of transdisciplinary institution where we bring in people with all different types of expertise to work on many, many projects in parallel.
We're going to pick up on that in a moment because I think there's definitely gold to be mined there. But we might just step back into the kind of the chronology of it. And so you've done your undergraduate. You've now done you've studied English and computer science. What did you do next?
So I was very interested in artificial intelligence and in natural language processing.
Okay.
As the sort of the area of crossover between the two in some ways.
No, so this is, so are we talking the kind of the late 80s now at this stage, is it?
Yes, that's
so,
right. Yeah.
So AI in the late 80s is vastly different to if somebody's listening today and thinking about artificial intelligence. They're almost like separate disciplines. Or
almost.
Yeah.
Although the seeds of what happened today were sown back then. So, and in fact, I was actually interested in the thing that didn't succeed as well, which is the more symbolic logical programming, things like Lisp and Prolog programming, and trying to actually define rules that then built complex rule-based systems and things like that. But what I did was I immersed myself in a taught master's that was in the University of Cambridge. And it was hosted by two departments, the Department of Engineering and the Computer Science Lab, the Computer Lab, which only had postgraduate students. And the two approaches were computer speech and natural language processing. So understanding the computer speech was mainly led by the engineering department, and they used all sorts of stochastic methods like hidden Markov models and things like that. And that's where I first learned about neural networks, and we did some work on that. And then in the computer science lab, we were working on sort of Linux or Unix-based workstations, these big monitor type beasts, which had always been my kind of dream to be working on these types of things, X Windows, all that sort of stuff. And we were working on trained grammars and models that had been built by previous generations of students and researchers, and then studying some topic ourselves to try and extend it and make a difference. And we had lectures from people who were linguists and people who were like neither engineers nor computer scientists. It was itself a sort of multidisciplinary kind of focus. And it was very intense, lots of interesting people from all over the world, and the experience of being a student in Cambridge. So the whole thing was a very interesting experience overall.
Okay, and again, there's that similar theme, again, that multidisciplinary theme, which is obviously prevalent across your entire career. Because where did you go next?
So then I went to a university / polytechnic, as it was at the time when I started, in Preston, in Lancashire, in the northwest of England. And I got a paid position as a research student, and I studied knowledge elicitation for expert systems. So the techniques that you might use to try and get information from experts so that you could codify a system to build a system that could augment and or replace those experts in certain limited circumstances.
So could you give an example of maybe what an expert system is like?
So like the sort of the cutting edge ones we were looking at the time were things like could you use a computer system to help triage patients in a hospital so that you could immediately figure out that this person was very high risk and you shouldn't leave them sitting for 2 hours versus someone else who was much lower risk and could, when they presented with chest pain, for example. But the problem with the fairly limited forms of AI at the time, because there was much less training data available and so on at the time in the 80s, was that some implicit limitation of how you train the thing could often lead to a very bad result. So a famous example is that if you didn't actually ask people or model whether someone was pregnant, that could lead to a lot of the symptoms, and your expert system could completely ignore that and be misdiagnosing people. And of course, it also is a classic thing in AI that if you're not careful, you can end up with biases of how the research is conducted, actually then coming forth in the system itself when it's produced. So I was aware of that from a very early point in my career.
Might you have been aware of that because of your name? Mícheál Ó'Foghlú, you have I mean because I mean you have fadas in your name. There's also O apostrophe. I suffer from this as well. I still can't believe it. In 2021, I was filling out a thing for the bank recently, and it was given out to me about an invalid character in my name. I was like, oh my God, how can this still be the case? But that's an example of those biases at play. And that's a really small example. Imagine if somebody was using a kind of a non-Western alphabet, or again, the way we read from left to right, top to bottom. That's not the way everything is in the world.
So I was brought up in Northern Ireland in Bangor, County Down, and I went to secondary school in Belfast. And so certainly when I was studying in England, even though I really enjoyed the experience, I certainly was exposed to the elements of anti-Irish racism that were prevalent at the time. I think that it is less now than it was back then. But at the time, it was the height of Thatcherism, and there was the tension in Northern Ireland spilling over into terrorist activity in Northern Ireland. So I think in England, so things were very tense, and some of that got reflected in how I was treated by some institutions. For example, when the royal family came to visit the lab, I was asked politely not to be there when I was in Cambridge.
How did that make you feel?
Well, I always felt like a bit of an outsider in England, but it certainly reinforced it then.
Yeah. Because particularly, I mean, you would have been a young person working away, thinking you were doing good work, and then, again, being politely pushed behind a curtain or
yes.
You know, that obviously would have an effect on you.
So it makes me feel now, I have a lot of empathy for the way blacks are treated in North America and the way Muslims are treated post 9/11. And I'm very involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion programs inside Google to make sure that we try and counter the conscious and unconscious biases that people might have in how they're treated. And I think it's really important. One has to be careful about just portraying oneself as a victim all the time. Obviously, by many of these criteria, I'm in an extremely privileged position, you know, as a white male technologist who has a very reasonable comfort in terms of income and so on. I certainly don't think of myself currently as a victim. Yeah,
but is that one of the reasons why you ended up moving back to Ireland then?
Yes, it was partly that, and I actually have a good story about that. So I went with friends of my brother to a holiday cottage in Donegal. We'd gone on the Gaeltacht to Donegal as children. And we were playing, basically, as adults, as young adults. And we went on a boat in a lake looking up at Mount Errigal, and that was fantastic. We built a dam of rocks on a river together, collectively, a bunch of, I don't know, 6 or 7 of us. We flew a kite on a fishing line up so far up in the sky you almost couldn't see it anymore, right? And what it reminded me of was that it's really important to have a work-life balance where you really enjoy where you are and the environment where you are, and you're able to try and recapture some of the joys that you had as a child and be involved in playful, explorative things. And it contrasted with some of the options I had in England, where a lot of the research was related to defence funding. and especially in the sort of machine learning kind of artificial intelligence space. So like colleagues of mine who'd studied with me in Cambridge went to work with the Ministry of Defence doing voice activation systems for fighter pilots and things like this. And I just did not want to do that. And that's part of the reason I came back to Ireland. And I came to NUI Galway, as it was at the time. And interestingly, I had to do an Irish exam to get there, and that was good. I was able to do that. And I also was a little bit disillusioned with just the pure academia part of academia, but I still loved the idea of the exploratory part of academia. So I moved into computer services in Galway just to work on things there.
And then how did you end up in Waterford?
So probably the biggest thing that happened to me in Galway was that I was in charge of the library system because it was a Unix-based system. I got really into Unix. I loved it.
Okay, so a library system. So going back to your Spectrum days,
exactly.
It came back. You were saying, I'm going to crack this one. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. We used a third-party product, of course. It was a thing called Dynix. It was produced by a software company in Utah. I traveled around Ireland meeting various people, including I actually traveled to Waterford and met the people who ran the library in Waterford City and the library in Dungarvan because they used Dynix as well. But anyway, the librarian spotted that I was quite a talent and decided to take me with her on a trip to Pisa in Italy for an academic library conference where they were looking at the future opportunities for information science. And at that conference, one of Tim Berners-Lee's colleagues presented the World Wide Web, and I was just blown away. This was 1992. So I came back to Galway and said, look, I've got to get myself a Linux machine so I can run the HTTPD server so that I can actually experiment with these web servers, because I had been trying to do similar kind of text-based things, Gopher and various other technologies that were around in the late 80s and the early 90s. And then I became the first webmaster of NUI Galway, and I was very proud when the front page of our website was featured on the Irish Times under the headline "The West's Awake."
So what year would this have been?
About 1994.
Okay, so this is at the very, very start of the World Wide Web.
What we're talking about here is that there was a machine in UCD called Slarty, named after the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy character who designed the fjords in Norway.
Slarty Bartfass, is that it?
Slarty Bartfass, that's right. And on that page, they actually had a map of Ireland with a dot representing every web server in Ireland.
Wow.
So that's how early it was, right? So it was like in the first 10 to 100 web servers. Like for Dublin, you had to click in to see them all. For Galway, there was about 5 or 6, including some of my colleagues in the Department of Engineering and whatever. We all were talking to each other. It was a very fascinating period.
And then you ended up coming down to Waterford.
Yeah, so probably the key thing I noticed was that I felt I was not being treated as an equal by the academics in Galway because I was on the computer services side.
Yes, okay.
And like even though positions were coming up, I wasn't really considered that I was suitably qualified. So I kind of liked the culture of the Institutes of Technology where the industrial and practical experience was equally valued to the academic experience. And I came down to Waterford. And one of the first things I did actually was notice that the way the web was being taught in Waterford, this was 1996, I started in September 96, that people were just editing web pages on their Windows machines and then opening them as local files. So they never got to experience what it would be like to publish the web page to a real web server, which I thought was a shame. So I managed to get an old machine and get Linux installed on it, and I set it up as a mechanism so that my students would be able to actually publish their websites and see where they'd made some assumptions about like how Windows organizes its file names and things like that didn't work when we published them potentially to a Unix-based web server. And then I went on to build a website for the fourth year students so they could actually do, by this time, you could do CGI programming and sort of programmatic stuff with the web, and I was quite interested in that as well. Yeah.
Okay, and from that then, you met a couple of other people in the department and you decided to go off, do you know what, let's set up a research group. Now, was that a kind of, was it, okay, now we look at, okay, so we're dealing with Walton. It's a huge group and it has a long and varied history. But go back to what, 1996, 1997. Was it really? Yeah. I've heard stories that like Willie Donnelly, who set up the TSSG, is now currently the president of the institute, and part of the reason why Eamon de Lester ended up setting up the group was that Eamon had a phone, and Willie didn't. Is there some equally as mad story as to how you ended up involved in this early research group?
Now the story is this, probably that Eamon had been there the longest. He was already there many years, and he'd done R&D funded projects in the Regional Technical College, RTC, as it was called at the time.
Yeah.
And Willie came a little bit before me. I think he came around March, April time, so maybe 6 months before I got there. And he came with an already funded project from the EU. And so they talked to me as soon as I arrived. I don't know how they learned about me, but it's probably a small enough place, right? And offered me a chance to get involved from day one. And I said, look, I've only just arrived. I need to get on top of my teaching and my primary responsibility, but I'm very interested. And then what ended up happening was I got involved very soon, like maybe within 7 or 8 months, I got involved in helping proofread and give advice to research students who were writing their thesis documents. So I became involved even though I wasn't formally as yet in the group. And then an opportunity arose to come in and lead one of the research projects, which was called the Natura project, which was an EU project that WIT was leading. We changed our name to WIT by this stage. And I was able to get some time off my teaching load by giving some money to pay for a replacement person using this funding. That then allowed me to engage more fully in the TSSG. So kindly, they've always considered me as a co-founder, but in practice, I probably lagged just slightly, and the real initial founding was Willie and Eamon themselves. But very soon, the three of us were writing the key research proposals. Probably the first was when we applied for HEA PRTLI 3 funding, and we didn't succeed. And then we applied for HEA PRTLI 4 funding, and we did succeed. And that led to the capital investment that allowed the buildings to be constructed in the Carriganor campus and so on, and led to the sort of TSSG having a really strong physical identity as well as a sort of virtual identity. And praise to Willie, actually, that we moved out of the main campus to a slightly not very far, it's only about 10 minutes walk across the road. But we were co-located then very quickly with the innovation program. So Willie was always very conscious of trying to balance the academic research part with the regional impact via innovation and links to local industry. And so even though we weren't formally joined in any governance sense, we were going to each other's meetings. We were involved in discussions on the sort of the critical mass of different types of thinking that made the future Walton possible. Started back in those early days.
Yeah, because I mean, you'd even physically have a cup of tea with each other, and
yes.
Again, an awful lot of profound conversations have happened over a cup of tea or a pint or a sandwich or whatever. You know, it's when you're not trying to have that conversation. Sometimes those things can happen.
We did have a joke at the time when we were planning the Carriganor campus that the cafeteria was actually the most important building because it was where the interchange between the different people would happen. Yeah. And we were very conscious of trying to make sure that wasn't just like a squidgy small corner, but it was a bigger space where larger groups could come, and then we could potentially repurpose it for events and so on. And that turned out to be a very good decision, and it's gone on from strength to strength.
So while you were in TSSG, you would have worked on a large number of projects, one of which was FeedHenry. And how did you go from TSSG to FeedHenry? And what happened with FeedHenry, I suppose, is the next thing.
So I suppose I decided in terms of doing my own doctorate that I needed to do a doctorate in something that was not directly involved in my day-to-day work in TSSG so that I could kind of separate them. And I started on my doctorate and finished it around about 2010. And it was in Irish R&D research funding policy. So I was looking at research and innovation, the academic justification for it, and the how much of that academic justification was formally cited in the policy documents produced by the various Irish government research bodies, including the HEA and then the SFI when it was established, and so on and so forth. And when I finished my doctorate, I then wondered what next. And at that time, we had a very successful internal project that was FeedHenry that had gone through 2 or 3 phases of Enterprise Ireland funding. It had pivoted from its initial idea. I was involved just for at the edge, just making some advice about 1 or 2 things that they were trying to aggregate RSS feeds, which is a sort of a distributed way of exposing information in a standard way, and then reason about those RSS feeds, and that's why feed is in the name. And so the research project itself was called FeedHenry. But by the time we'd got to 2010, it had already pivoted to be more about a cross-platform app development technology that allowed you to put things on mobile phones or on devices. And this was a very exciting time for mobile phones because only in the last couple of years, the iPhone had been launched and the Android phone had been launched. But still equally powerful at that early stage were the telco type phones that included the Nokia phone that was actually based entirely on some W3 web standards. And I was actually the WIT's representative on the W3C. So I was involved in the Central Standardization Process Group. That's the group led by Tim Billingsley. And so what happened was we'd set up this whole company. We'd gone out and searched for a proactive serial entrepreneur to lead it, whose name was Cathal McGloin, and he'd agreed to do this. But the person who we'd lined up to be the CTO of the company backed out for personal reasons. And so we were now looking very bad in front of this external person that we'd persuaded to come in and take a bet on us.
Yeah.
And we were out in one of the restaurants along the Dunmore Road having a chat about what we would do about this. And Cathal McGloin was telling us, look, I'm heading off to San Francisco in a few weeks' time to pitch this company to Andreessen Horowitz in Sandhill Road in Silicon Valley, and you're telling me we don't have a CTO, right? Okay. and I just said, I'll do it, right? It was almost completely off the cuff, but it was partly because I was mentally at the stage of thinking I'd gone the full academic journey. I'd got to the point where I had my doctorate. I didn't have anything else to prove on the academic side. But the whole culture of the TSSG was that the commercial and the links to industry was equally important. And yet I was not giving that any equal importance in terms of what I was doing. So I thought, well, I'll take the bet and I'll see if I can do it. So I came in and very quickly got on top of the technology stack, and we made some interesting decisions. We actually did the spin out in Q4 of 2010. I went with Cathal. We pitched to Andreessen Horowitz. They didn't actually give us funding, but it was a great experience. And then we successfully got our seed investment, and then we were able within a year or two to pitch for round A investment from Intel Capital, and we built the company up. I was involved with the sales people, actually pitching to customers and trying to persuade them of the innovative nature of our proposal. And I ended up then being part of the acquisition process where Red Hat acquired us in 2014.
And you stayed with the company then?
Yes, so I became the site lead of the Waterford office. And my key concern, as well as making the technology a success, was to look after the team in Waterford that I had been leading. And we were able to get good investment to build a new office in Waterford. That's still the Red Hat office. It's a fantastic place. And we were able to find our place in the company in a way that was very successful.
And right, so Red Hat are quite synonymous in Waterford now. They're probably the leading tech company in the locality. But obviously, we can hear the journey that it's gone on to get to that point. And actually, from the way you're describing it, how it almost didn't happen, which I suspect is true of many stories in tech and business and across all disciplines. So how did you end up, you're in Germany now today, and I'm in Waterford. How did you end up going to Google in Germany and upping sticks like that?
Yeah. So my partner Mary also worked in WIT in the German department. She's an English and German lecturer. And she had previously worked in Germany for 5 years, same time as when I was in Galway, in the University of Bayreuth, teaching English as a foreign language to the German students, and business and academic English in particular. And so we'd always thought that it would be nice to go to Germany for a while. And our children were sort of still in primary school, but getting close to moving into secondary school. And we thought this might be the best time to do it before they're in sort of critical exam year kind of schooling things, and we had less flexibility about moving. So I was open to possibilities. I was also aware that if I stayed in Red Hat, I was so much associated with the Waterford office that it would be tough for me to get internal opportunities in Red Hat just because of how I was perceived almost. And sometimes I was actually very happy in the job, but I thought I needed a new challenge, basically. And then a recruiting person from Google approached me with an opportunity, and I started to investigate it. And as I got more and more involved in the investigation and went through the interview process, I became more and more excited about the opportunity. And then I actually took the offer, and I actually had a 6-month notice period. So my next concern was to make sure that I exited Red Hat smoothly, not disadvantaging any of the team in the Waterford office. And I was able to help my successor, who had been one of my reports, James Mernon, grow into the role of the site lead and the engineering lead of the team. And that's gone on from success to success as well. So it's actually one of the things I'm proudest of in my career is how smoothly I exited Red Hat.
It's funny because that's something that is probably unseen to the outside world, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I think that's quite interesting. It probably speaks to your character as well. So I know you can't talk about the work that you're doing at Google now. I mean, you could tell us, but you would have to kill us. But you know, we go back to the very first question I asked you about what excites you about tech. Are you still as excited today as you were all the way back then, back in those Spectrum days?
Yeah. Now, some people may find this hard to believe and may think I'm just drinking the Kool-Aid. But one of the things about Google is that as a company, it really is trying to make the world a better place. It does have its failings. It's an organization made up of human beings who've made some mistakes. Some of them are very public. But the whole culture of the organization is about trying to empower people to change people's lives for the better. And most of Google's services are free services that many people rely on to have a better quality of life in many different ways. Education not being the least. So if you couldn't Google search for information, just imagine how much poorer people's modern educational experience would be. And then like our navigation systems like Google Maps and it's a free email service of Gmail and so on and so forth. Yes, we do have a business model. We couldn't afford to do this if we didn't. And our business model for most of those products is based around advertising, and that has a lot of controversy associated with it. But at its core, we try and make sure that we're completely legal and that we ask people's permission for what we're doing. And the reason we do it is so that we can afford to provide all those other free services that billions of people use. So I think the count keeps ticking up, but I think we're getting close to 8 or 9 services that have more than 1 billion monthly active users, which is more of those types of services than any other company on the planet. And what excites me about Google is that it's continuing to try and solve really hard problems and invest in things like, not least, say, on the environmental side, we were one of the first tech companies to run, carbon neutral data centers. We're now trying to run carbon neutral company as a whole. And the way that we did the carbon neutral data centers, in fact, created the market for carbon neutral energy in many jurisdictions. So we were such an influential customer that we forced the energy providers to create processes whereby they could measure these things, and they could then guarantee that they were actually accounting for the carbon footprint of the energy production. And that's kind of like a baseline upon which any response to our current climate crisis actually needs, right? So if the companies can't actually tell you what their impact is, it's very hard to actually move forward. Which is part of Google's interesting culture internally, which is kind of measure what matters, right? So we try and make data-based decisions, and we try and instrument things to measure and understand them, and then we try and decide what the critical metric is that we need to try and move, and then we experiment with different things to see what actually makes things move in the right direction. And that's how we can manage to evolve and progress so many huge projects and products in parallel and continue to have a very positive trajectory in nearly all of them.
So I'm not trying to ask you a personal question about like your own family life, but obviously the trip to Germany or the move to Germany has served you well, because I imagine you're in a position where if you wanted to leave, you could. You don't have to be there. Nobody's put a gun to your head and said you must stay here. So you obviously enjoy it. You like the place.
Yes.
You like the environment.
It's fabulous. Yeah. So interestingly, for people who live in Dublin and complain about the house prices, I advise you to visit Munich and have a look. You might get a surprise, right? So it's an expensive place to live, but the actual services probably are slightly higher in quality than the equivalent ones in Ireland. In particular, the public transport infrastructure is absolutely mind-boggling, and very, very cost-effective, very, very good value for money. And the health system is very good, and the social support network is very good. The taxes are relatively high, similar amounts to Irish taxes, but it funds a very strong safety net for the weaker members of society. And famously, Germany has been very open and welcoming to many different types of immigrants over the past number of decades. And indeed, Google sponsors many projects to help those things and so on. And so it's a very open, friendly, and sort of supportive place to live, and it's beautiful as well. It like when you walk down and you can see the Alps in the distance, and then you can drive there in like an hour, and you can be going up in a cable car to crazy distances, 3 or 4 times the height of the highest mountain in Ireland, And wow. But the thing that I miss most is probably the Irish people and the sense of humor, and the sea, right? So like it's in this part of Germany, you're kind of a long way away from the sea. There's some beautiful lakes, but there's nothing quite like just going along the Dunmore East cliff walk and looking out at the Atlantic and hearing the waves break. So that's one of the first places I always go when I go back to visit Ireland.
It's interesting what you said about Google, and I'm just trying to think about the way you were talking at the beginning about studying English, and you're now working for a company that is actually a verb that has become part of the language itself. Has that ever crossed your mind that, what would Mícheál Ó'Foghlú, who was age 20, think of now working for a company that has become part of the vocabulary?
Well, the weirdest thing is that for half of my career in tech, Google didn't exist.
Of course, right? yeah.
So that it was founded only just 21 years ago, and yet it is now such a behemoth in the landscape that people can't imagine what it was like before they existed. I suppose on the language side, the thing that's most amazing is the Google Translate. Right? So basically, if I'm walking around Germany, I can just take out my camera, put it to photo mode, and then translation hovers above the image automatically. So I can read signage in German without having to do anything else, and it's just mind-bogglingly useful to provide that service to so many people.
I often joke to students, particularly first-year students, that I say, look, I've been around for quite some time, and I remember the internet. I remember when it began, or sorry, the World Wide Web. The internet had been around before that, but I remember when it began, and I also remember a time where you needed to know stuff in your head. We didn't have Google as our collective memory. Right, so that's a kind of a flippant statement, ha ha ha. But I wonder if you would have a particular bit of advice maybe for students, say first year computing student. Is there any kind of little nugget that you might have for them saying, check this out, or do this, or do that, or don't do this?
Yeah, one of my personal interests, it's kind of reflected partly in my current mode in Google, where I'm responsible for infrastructure that supports our developers internally. So primarily 2 parallel systems, one of which is kind of proprietary, we built it ourselves, and the other one of which is based on Git, which is well known externally. Android and Chrome are the 2 biggest customers who use the Git-based one, and pretty much all of our internal Google services use the other one, famously in one single large mono repo. So I've always been interested in the technology that underpins how the processes are allowed to happen. And I think that what I would advise students is not just to take the structure that is provided for you by your course, but to be intellectually curious and experimental and build your own parallel infrastructure, even spending some of your own money to do so. Because it's just like buying a book is valuable, buying access to your own infrastructure is valuable. And so don't undervalue the cost of getting your own virtual machine in DigitalOcean is fairly negligible. $5 a month gets you an entry level machine of your own to play about with in the cloud. And tear things up, tear them down, build them back up again, learn how the infrastructure itself works, and not just the language that you're learning as a computer language. So how is it deployed? How is it hosted? How does it scale? Those sort of questions. And don't overlook there's some excellent free tier entries from Microsoft Azure and Amazon AWS and Google's GCP. So students can get free virtual machines for 12 months, typically in most of those services. So experiment with those. And then one I use personally myself is the Firebase hosting, which is one of Google's offerings. And it allows you to just host a website for free. It automatically secures it with HTTPS for free with no additional admin. And it automatically gives you IPv6 as well as IPv4 access. So it's future-proofed for the future internet. And it automatically scales globally as a content delivery network. So it's quite an amazing thing, right? And you can also deploy apps into Firebase as well with some really cool data synchronization properties. So that the model is you focus on the client side, and the server side kind of auto-generates based on the options that you've chosen on the client side. It's not a model that suits every problem, but it's a model that suits very many problems, and it makes the software development much easier because you don't have to worry about trying to synchronize the two together so much. So basically, be curious, build stuff yourself, play around with it, explore the technologies that are on offer, and don't be afraid if that means, I have to spend €20 or something. Just spend it, right? Because the value that you get from actually owning the experience end to end is actually invaluable in terms of your maturity as thinking about tech problems.
One of the things about computing and technology, and even the services that you've described, is that you can make a bags of it. it's quite low stakes. It's not like, oh, I'll buy a car and I'll build a car and I'll test it out. That's a massive hardware cost, and if you make a bags of it, you might injure yourself or somebody else. Whereas virtual machines or small computers, I have a stack of Raspberry Pis here in front of me. If you make a complete hames of it, you can just flash the card, start again, or spin down the virtual machine, start again.
Yes.
It's like the cost to entry, the barrier to entry is incredibly low.
Yes. And the really important thing is that if you've got something important, it's not enough just to get it working once. You need to automate it so that it's repeatable. Otherwise, you end up with this crazy problem that many people in tech have observed, where somebody files a bug and the engineer says it worked on my machine. Okay. So there's some strange difference in the config of that engineer's machine and where it's deployed in production. That means it's not working for the customer, but it's working for the engineer. And what you need is to put processes in place that reduce the risk of that ever happening.
Yeah, but again, that comes down to the kind of the rigor and the method and professionalism, I suppose, And even then, what you've said about, many of the things throughout your own career is that there's as much things where they didn't work the first time, but you went back and you tried it again. You didn't get funding for that. This didn't work that time, but we went at it again and we did it better. I know that, but fail again, fail better. I know, like it's a well-worn path.
And famously, Silicon Valley doesn't punish entrepreneurs who have failed startups. They just regard that as essential experience that's required to build up knowledge. And if those of us in the rest of the world, and most of us do, want to emulate the amazing inventiveness and innovation culture of Silicon Valley, learning to actually respect people who might have not succeeded in one or two of the things they've tried is an important part of that journey. And I'd certainly very much agree with that.
I was going to ask you about advice for a researcher, but to be honest with you, I think what you were saying there about being curious is probably just good advice in general across the board. So I want to move on to something else that's just a kind of a random one, but it popped into my head last night because I was just looking up some stuff about you before the interview, and I found your blog, your old Ó'Foghlú.net blog. And I remember, like, years and years and years ago, you were recommending to us in TSSG to, you should all have you should blog and you should write and you should do this, that and the other thing. It doesn't have to all be wonderful purple prose. It can just be anything. And on your blog, Ó'Foghlú.net, which is still running, and it has an archive that goes back to February 2002. And what I love about the blog that you have is that it's proper old school. There's nothing fancy on it. It looks like, is it all still hand coded? It looks very, very, it looks like a 1990s website. And it's like, I'm hanging on to this. And I kind of like that.
So I actually did migrate it from the blogging platform that I used at the time. And now it's just a static website. So probably some images broken, but the core content is there. And I published it on that Firebase hosting thing that I mentioned previously. So at least it's searchable and retrievable, and the old URL links that might have been indexed still work. And so I kind of regard it as kind of like a digital kind of archive of things I might have been interested in the past. And I have a librarian's kind of mindset about this stuff, that if you create a permanent link to something, you should maintain it. You shouldn't just restructure everything and change all the links every time it takes your fancy.
Yeah, and there's actually some lovely nuggets in there. And one of the things I found in it is your book recommendations, which it's based on a list that somebody else had written, and then you're going through the list and you're commenting on it, and a lot of it is to do with kind of sci-fi and fantasy. Are there any ones out there, again, thinking about kind of first year students or early career people, any books or things out there that do you know what, you really should read that, because there's quite a lot in it? I mean, we've mentioned The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We'll just give that's a given. Everyone should read that, regardless of whether you're a computing student or not. Everyone should read it. But is there anything
my recommendation for Hitchhiker's Guide is actually to listen to the original Radio 4 radio series.
Yes,
you can get it as a podcast now, so
yes,
that's kind of cool.
Okay, is there any one book or even a film or anything that you think, you should read that, you should have a listen to that, you should watch that?
Well, the most recent thing that I've read that I would recommend to people, it's quite an old book. It actually dates back to 1992. It's written by a guy called Jared Diamond, and it's called The Third Chimpanzee. And he later wrote a book called Guns, Germs and Steel. That's a little bit more famous. But some of the ideas in Guns, Germs and Steel appear in The Third Chimpanzee. So the basic premise of The Third Chimpanzee is that if you look at genetically at human beings and at the two surviving species of chimpanzee, the genetic differences between them are almost negligible. And so he's posing the question, what are those differences that can have such a huge difference in terms of how successful we have been as a species compared to the others? And he also asks some very challenging questions, such as how much of our behaviors that we consider unique to us actually have examples in the animal kingdom that we just choose not to focus on. And one of the things he points out is that chimpanzees murder each other. And so on and so forth. But he actually mentions one of the things that I like most in Guns, Germs and Steel, and I didn't realize he mentioned it as early as this, which was maybe 5 or 6 years earlier in his career. And he mentions the fact that his rationale for why European cultures ended up dominating the world, not surprisingly, it's not because we're genetically superior in any sense whatsoever. It's very circumstantial, and the circumstantials are kind of physical geography and also the flora and the fauna. Right? So in Europe, we had more species that could be domesticated, and we had more plants that could be farmed than in any other geography on the planet. Point A. And point B, we had the alignment geographically meant that you could move east-west to expand, which meant that the same growing conditions occurred in the place that you moved to. So you could take the plants that worked in Mesopotamia, you could go along the north of the Mediterranean all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, and the same plants would still grow. Right? And compare that to the scenario in North and South America, where you're on a north-south axis. So as soon as you move a few hundred kilometers, you need different varieties of plants to deal with the different conditions. And so that really made it much harder for the underlying civilizations there to thrive as much as our civilizations did. And I think just this high-level approach to trying to understand what we are as a species and what makes us successful, and understanding that the human diversity is not about superior beings per se, but maybe some unfair advantages that certain parts of the world may have had at certain points in history is fascinating.
Yeah. So we're talking on a tech podcast, but what you're describing there, again, multidisciplinary, it could be for anything really, but it's probably important that maybe tech people understand these things, or at least have an awareness of them.
Yeah, because I think we need to use some of those kind of mindset things to address the big challenges that we have today, such as climate change. And I'm very excited about the possibility for kind of reimagining how transport and other energy-hungry things work so that we use less energy. I'm very excited about the ways that we might be able to change the way energy is produced so that it's carbon neutral. And I'm very excited about the technologies we might be able to create that can actually try and undo some of the damage that we've done, such as carbon capture and carbon sequestration and things like that. Right? And I think everyone alive today should be thinking about how they can contribute in different ways to meeting those challenges. And one of the tools we have is technology, and it could prove to be a very useful tool.
That's a wonderful note to end on, I think. It's kind of hopeful and positive and constructive. So, Mícheál, thank you so much for your time today. I really do appreciate it. Touch wood, we'll see you back in Ireland sometime soon. And if you're heading out on a cliff walk around about Dunmore or anywhere else, and you fancy a cup of tea or a pint or a biscuit, please drop us a line. You'd always be welcome. And sure, hopefully we might even see you back on campus in WIT soon as well.
Super. I'd love to do that.
Yeah, you can come in, you can see here the curry chips still as good as they always were.
Very good indeed. Yeah.